Imagine an entire nation watching its greatest agricultural pride rot before its very eyes. That is exactly what happened in Azerbaijan when tons of tomatoes, once a symbol of prosperity, turned into mountains of waste and humiliation. Welcome to Telnomics, the channel where we connect numbers, power, and geopolitics. Today, you will discover how a simple tomato became the spark that ignited a crisis capable of shaking strategic alliances, humiliating leaders, and exposing the fragility of an entire economy. Stay until the end, because this story, which begins with an ordinary food, soon unfolds into a drama of international scale. To grasp the severity, we need to look at the numbers. According to data from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, in 2023, Azerbaijan exported more than 200,000 tons of tomatoes, with about 90% destined for the Russian Federation. That means 9 out of every 10 boxes were headed for Moscow. But what happens when that market suddenly closes overnight? The result was immediate collapse. Within just a few months, the price of a box of tomatoes fell so drastically that it cost less than a bottle of mineral water, according to local surveys published by Eurasianet in December 2023. On the streets of Baku, the capital, outrage spread quickly. Farmers drowning in debt had no way to repay loans, and warehouses were overflowing with produce left to rot. Social media was flooded with images of decaying tomatoes piled high, accompanied by sarcastic comments. One user wrote, "We used to feed Russia. Now we are drowning in our own harvest." Memes turned an agricultural product into a symbol of national failure. This was not just about economics. It was wounded pride, a threatened identity. And in the middle of this chaos, the central question emerged. Was this really just about phytosanitary regulations as Moscow officially claimed? Or was it in fact a far more calculated act of political retaliation? After all, President Ilham Aliyev's increasingly aggressive rhetoric against Russia in recent years had brought Azerbaijan closer to the West, something that deeply irritated the Kremlin. And when politics and economics intersect, the ones who pay the price are, as always, ordinary people. While tons of tomatoes decayed, a climate of panic spread. Export companies watched contracts collapse, farmers cried out for relief, and banks demanded debts that could no longer be repaid. The tomato crisis seemed to have no way out. But could a risky gamble turn the tide? And how far would authorities be willing to go to rescue an entire sector? When everything seemed lost, a plan emerged in Baku that combined desperation with audacity. If Azerbaijani tomatoes were condemned, why not transform them into something else? The answer seemed simple: label them as Turkish. After all, Turkey maintained solid relations with the Russian Federation, and according to the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture, in 2023, the country exported more than $1.8 billion worth of fresh fruits and vegetables to Moscow, consolidating itself as a reliable supplier. The logic was irresistible. If tomatoes carried a Turkish label, the Russian market would accept them without hesitation. Thus began a nearly clandestine operation. Entire warehouses were transformed into improvised assembly lines. Workers tore off labels with names like Baku Tomats and replaced them with fresh stickers marked Made in Turkey, along with export seals from Kars, a Turkish city near the border. Trucks unloaded rolls of labels and cardboard boxes with Turkish logos, while entire teams repacked what had previously been considered unsellable. The result was visually flawless: Azerbaijani tomatoes disguised as Turkish exports. But visual camouflage alone was not enough. To convince customs officials, an arsenal of paperwork was required. Specialists were hired to produce falsified phytosanitary certificates, international invoices, even stamps from supposed Turkish regulatory bodies. Each document looked authentic, complete with signatures and carefully replicated numerical codes. It was a high-stakes gamble. If discovered, the country would not only face economic failure, but also the loss of trust from its allies. Can you imagine the scale of this bet? It was as if a local merchant decided to sell spoiled goods with the label of a luxury brand, believing no one would notice the difference. In the short term, it might work, but a single inconsistency would be enough for the entire scheme to collapse. And here, the crucial questions arise. Would Russia, with one of the strictest inspection systems in the region, really accept such theater so easily? And how would Turkey react once it realized its reputation was being used as a shield to cover up another country's crisis? At the heart of this story, we are no longer talking just about tomatoes. We are talking about credibility, about trust, and about the strategic alliances that sustain entire economies. And this is precisely where the narrative takes on an inevitable tone of suspense, because the trains loaded with tomatoes carrying Turkish labels were already on their way to the border. But what would happen once they arrived there? If you want to discover how far this fraud went and which technical detail would bring the entire scheme crashing down, subscribe now to Telnomics, turn on notifications, and leave your like. From here on, the plot only becomes more dangerous and more revealing. Two massive trains, crammed with boxes of tomatoes now proudly stamped with the Made in Turkey seal, departed from Baku bound for the Russian Federation. Every wagon, every document, every stamp appeared flawless. Behind the scenes, Azerbaijani officials breathed a sigh of relief. If the first part of the plan worked, millions could be recovered, and the public humiliation would be softened. But could a single technical detail bring this entire performance crashing down? As they reviewed the papers, Russian border guards noticed an intriguing inconsistency. The itinerary indicated that the shipment had departed from Kars, passed through Georgia, and then headed directly into Russia. Everything seemed in order, except for one point: the difference in railway gauge. Turkey uses the European standard of 1,435 millimeters, while Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Russia itself all use the Russian standard of 1,520 millimeters. This means any train leaving Turkey must stop at a station to change axles or transfer cargo, a process that takes between 4 and 8 hours, according to the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization's 2022 report. In the documents presented by the Azerbaijanis, this stage simply did not exist. It was as if the trains had crossed magical borders without any technical adjustments. A seemingly trivial oversight, but one that revealed the fraud. Russian inspectors, trained to detect contradictions, immediately grew suspicious. How could a train cross Georgia without any record of a gauge change? And why was there not even a single reference to this mandatory step in the paperwork? The Azerbaijani delegation hesitated. They tried vague explanations, promised to provide additional documents, but nothing seemed convincing. The border guards maintained pressure, sent an official request to Georgian authorities, and waited for the response. When it arrived, the verdict was devastating. These trains never passed through our territory. The shock was immediate. 2 long trains loaded with tomatoes were now stuck in a kind of diplomatic and economic limbo. Under the scorching heat, the smell of the fruit began to betray the passage of time. Farmers, exporters, and officials who had bet everything on this plan saw the situation slipping through their fingers. And here comes the inevitable question. What happens when a meticulously built lie is exposed by something as technical as the width of a railway track? The wagons remained at the border for days, like metallic ghosts filled with a past that could no longer be salvaged. The stench of the cargo spread rapidly. According to Eurasianet reports from November 2023, more than 100,000 tons of tomatoes had already been compromised, and every additional hour of delay meant losses amounting to millions of dollars. What was supposed to be a brilliant move for economic survival had turned into a spectacle of ruin, and all because of a documentary flaw that seemed far too insignificant for such an ambitious plan. The reaction of the Russian guards left no room for maneuver. They followed protocol, and after Georgia officially confirmed that no trains had crossed its territory, doubts were erased. Azerbaijan had orchestrated large-scale fraud. The fake labels, the fabricated invoices, the cars' seals printed on the boxes, all turned into evidence against Baku. National pride, already shaken by the agricultural crisis, was now buried under the weight of international shame. But the damage went beyond the rotting harvest. Every hour the trains remained stranded represented not only the loss of goods but also the collapse of international trust. How can a country be trusted if it tries to use the name of a strategic ally to bypass trade rules? How can alliances survive when commerce, the foundation of diplomacy itself, is turned into a stage for deception? These questions began to echo both in Moscow and in Ankara. The impact on farmers was devastating. Entire families who depended on the harvest watched their fields turn into scenes of bankruptcy. Local media showed images of farmers tearing tomatoes from the ground with their bare hands, unable to sell them even at rock-bottom prices. According to the World Bank, about 30% of Azerbaijan's active population still depends directly on agriculture, and when such a central sector collapses, the effect ripples through the entire economy. And in the midst of this disaster, an even darker shadow began to take shape. Because this was not just an internal scandal. Turkey's name was printed on every falsified tomato box, and soon Ankara would be dragged to the center of the crisis. The question now was, how would Turkey react once it saw its international reputation used as a shield to cover another country's disgrace? When the fraud finally came to light, the first victim was not only Azerbaijan, it was Turkey itself. The boxes carrying the Made in Turkey seal became ammunition against Ankara, raising doubts over its entire bilateral trade. Moscow reacted immediately. Every shipment coming from Turkey began to undergo strict inspections. According to the Turkish Fruit and Vegetable Exporters Association, cited by Anadolu Agency in December 2023, more than $1.8 billion in annual exports were now under direct threat. Trucks were stuck in endless lines, ships were detained at ports, and planes were left waiting in overcrowded airports. For perishable goods, such as tomatoes, peppers, and citrus fruits, a delay of just 24 hours meant almost total loss of market value. Turkish companies fell into logistical collapse. With each day of extended inspections, millions of dollars evaporated. Workers told local journalists that entire containers had to be discarded, while the smell of rotten produce filled warehouses and highways. What was supposed to be Azerbaijan's desperate move for survival had turned into an exported disaster, putting in jeopardy a partner that had always stood by its side. And here, the inevitable conflict emerged. How could Ankara tolerate having its name used as a facade for fraud on such a scale? The atmosphere in Baku was one of panic, but in Ankara the reaction was pure fury. Turkish business leaders demanded answers, agricultural unions pressured the government, and the press denounced the devastating impact of the fraud on legitimate trade. Daily Sabah, one of Turkey's main newspapers, reported in January 2024 that dozens of export contracts had been canceled and that losses had already exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars. With each new headline, the pressure on Recep Tayyip Erdogan mounted, but the hardest blow was still to come. As the investigation advanced, it was revealed that the order to falsify documents and use Turkish labels had not come from desperate businessmen, but from Azerbaijan's highest political circles. And according to sources cited by Hürriyet, Ilham Aliyev's name was directly tied to the plan. What would happen once this revelation reached the Turkish president? That was the breaking point. When the evidence reached Ankara, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan did not hesitate to act. The Turkish press, including Hürriyet in February 2024, reported that Erdogan personally called Ilham Aliyev in one of the most tense conversations in the recent history of the two countries. According to insiders, the Turkish leader completely lost his patience. He accused Aliyev of irresponsibility, of endangering billions in legitimate trade, and of putting Turkey's international reputation at risk. Harsh words such as stupidity and lack of intelligence were allegedly spoken without restraint. What had once been a relationship of strategic allies turned within minutes into a humiliating confrontation. Erdogan demanded immediate compensation. According to the Turkish Exporters Federation, published by Anadolu Agency, losses caused by inspections and spoiled goods had already exceeded $300 million. The message was clear. If Azerbaijan wanted to preserve any trace of partnership, it would have to foot the bill. Cornered and without alternatives, Aliyev accepted. Baku's budget, already suffocated by the collapse of exports, would now have to finance multi-million-dollar compensations to save Turkish companies harmed by the fraud. The domestic political impact was devastating. Azerbaijani farmers, who had already lost their harvests, now watched as the government diverted public funds not to rescue them, but to compensate foreign companies. Independent local outlets such as Meydan TV denounced that the state was sacrificing its own people to pay for the mistakes of a circle close to the president. Discontent grew, and Aliyev's image, once carefully crafted as that of a strong leader, began to crumble. But perhaps the most painful blow was the loss of trust. Turkey, which had historically supported Azerbaijan in critical moments, including during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, now treated Baku as a problematic and unreliable partner. The strategic bond, painstakingly built over decades, suffered a fracture that would be almost impossible to repair. And here the inevitable question arises: how can a country rebuild its international credibility after staining the name of its closest ally? The outcome was brutal. Azerbaijan lost on all fronts. Farmers went bankrupt, with more than 200,000 tons of tomatoes wasted, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's 2023 report. Exporters saw contracts vanish, banks pressed for unpaid debts, and thousands of families plunged into an economic collapse from which they would struggle to recover. But the damage did not stop there. Russia, angered by the fraud, demonstrated that it could shut its borders at any moment, reminding Azerbaijan of its structural dependence on neighboring markets. On the diplomatic stage, the wound was even deeper. Turkey, once its closest ally, became an unforgiving creditor. Erdogan demanded reparations, and Baku was forced to transfer hundreds of millions of dollars from the public budget to compensate foreign companies, while its own citizens suffered. For international analysts, as highlighted by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in January 2024, the crisis revealed a dangerous paradox. In trying to protect its economic elite, Aliyev sacrificed the trust of his allies and the dignity of his own nation. And the people? They were the greatest losers. The image of the tomato, once a symbol of national agricultural pride, became a symbol of shame. On social media, jokes and memes replaced what used to be a source of celebration, reinforcing the idea that corruption and greed had turned a basic food into a metaphor for political decay. And here lies the harshest reflection. If even the simplest food can be contaminated by hidden interests, what can be said about the future of an entire country? The tomato episode was not merely an agricultural crisis, but a bitter lesson on how misguided political decisions can destroy economies, alliances, and reputations. Azerbaijan did not just lose a harvest. It lost credibility, it lost allies, and it lost the respect of its own people. And the lingering question is unavoidable. How can trust be rebuilt once even the most loyal partners have been betrayed? If you've made it this far, it's because you want to understand how small decisions reveal great truths about global geopolitics. So, subscribe to Telnomics, leave your like, and share this video. Your support helps us continue bringing you deep and independent analyses of what truly drives the international chessboard. Thank you for watching, and prepare yourself because the next stories may be even more surprising.